In the previous lesson, I asked if you could determine the problem with the contract services get by ID method. The problem is that we're still working with hard-coded values. All right, it wasn't all that difficult to figure out. Obviously, this is not a production-worthy class just yet. Ideally, we'd pull values from a persistence class, or rather, a class in another layer that will actually return data to us from a data store. Once we get that data, then we can populate the properties in our new contract instance, sort of like what we did here, except with real data, and then return it back to the caller. But I don't want to worry about persistence just yet. I'm not ready to think about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a stub. And Martin Fowler wrote a now famous article called Mocks Aren't Stubs, and you should be able to see the URL there and in the lesson text. And he defines a stub as the following. Stubs provide canned answers to calls made during the test, usually not responding at all to anything outside of what's programmed in for the test. Stubs may also record information about calls, such as an email gateway stub that remembers messages it sent, or maybe only how many messages it sent. So what we need is a class that can act like a real persistence class, but we can hard code the values that we want in there. Yes, we're just really, all we're doing is just pushing these hard-coded values off to another layer to worry about it at another time. But that's fine. That's exactly what I want to do. I want this to be production worthy. I'll push the hard-coded values out into a stub class, but at least this will be right, okay? So what I'm going to do is create a new project, and I'm going to call it acme.maintenance.persistence, and I'll implement a class here that I'll hard-code values into. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a foreshadow here. I'm not going to be even satisfied with this solution. Hard coding may work with this particular use case that we've created, but I can foresee that we'll want a more flexible type of stub later on, and this simply won't do. However, I'm going to take this step so you can see the thought process. I'll wind up deleting this class that I create a little bit later, and then reusing this project that I'll create. Let's go ahead and create it. So I'm going to right click and select add new project, and this will be another let's go Windows so we get to the class library, and I'm going to call this acme.maintenance.persistence. Alright, but I'll start off with this. I'll go ahead and delete that class, and we're going to add a new class, and it's going to be called the contract repository. Alright, I'll wind up deleting this, like I said just a moment ago, but I'll reuse this new project much later in order to implement a real persistence layer. For now, we're going to hard code the values that will return to our contract service in this new class. So just pretend you never heard all that. Just follow along. We'll pretend like we're thinking this through, and it hasn't occurred to us yet that this stub isn't going to be ultimately what we want. All right. When I use the term repository here, I actually chose that very specifically. I have a very specific style, or rather pattern, in mind. Now, instead of getting sidetracked on that right now, I'll explain it in a mini-series called Repositories. You can watch it now if I've already finished it, or you can watch it after this series to learn more about the specifics of repositories. But in a nutshell, it's going to have a series of methods that will perform a series of tasks. For example, there will be a get by ID, there will be a get by something method, like a get by first name, or get by last name, or get by city, all right, something along those lines, where it'll find a list of items that match given some criteria, some property of our, in this case, contract. All right. Then there will also be a save and an update and a delete, and then we can get a list of items by. So get a single item and then get a list by. Okay. Now all of these are optional, and the key is what you include in these repository classes depends on what your domain class needs. The domain class drives the interface for the repository class. That's all I'm going to say about repositories for now. It's a term that means the class that handles data-related operations for a single domain class. All right. As with all things, there's a lot of variations and a lot of disagreements on how a repository should operate. And I don't want to go into all that right now. I'll just explain more in the mini-series on repositories. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start off by returning, so I'm going to do a public, and I'm going to return a contract, not a contract repository, just a contract. We'll get to that in just a moment. Get by ID, and we would expect contract ID to be passed in. Okay, and you can see here that I'm getting this little message. I get this because I'm using this tool ReSharper. It will allow me to add in the reference to a given class. Now this happens to be not the right class, so this is from the .NET Diagnostics namespace. I don't want that. What I need to do is I need to have a reference from this persistence back to the domain layer. So what I'll have to do is right click, add reference, and now I want to create a reference to acme.maintenance.domain and click OK. And this time, what we want is the acme.maintenance.domain.contract. All right. Okay, and now it adds in the correct using statement for acme.maintenance.domain.contract. Okay, very good. I have a decision to make here. Should I return an instance of contract here, or should I return a data transfer object? Well, really, as in all things, it depends. In this simple case, I could easily just handle the database access, grab the record in the database that corresponds with the contract ID input parameter, and then create a new contract and pass it back. But I don't really feel like this is the right course of action. Creating an instance of contract in this repository class suffers from the violation of the single responsibility principle. It's not only grabbing data from the database, but it will also be responsible for creating an instance of this contract. And that's already the job of the contract service on the domain layer. The other option is to create a dedicated data transfer object or class that would be used as a DTO. And now we talked about this in the Application Architecture Fundamental series. On the one hand, using a DTO makes sense in this case because it allows us to pass something back, a simple data container with just the data that we need from the repository to the contract service. But if we were ultimately to distribute this application across physical tiers in our enterprise, we would want to minimize the chatter between layers, and so we could use DTOs as a means of sending just the right data back to minimize the round trips between the physical tiers and reduce the data sizes of those packets. On the other hand, in this pithy little example that we're working on right here, it totally seems like overkill because the properties of the DTO, the data transfer object, are going to closely match the properties of the contract at this point, of the domain class. But for that matter, this entire architecture might be overkill. Again, I'm asking you to use your imagination a bit here. We want to pretend like this is an enterprise scale application. So keep in mind that if you have a simpler application, going to all this work of separating the responsibilities and delegating them to different classes and layers might seem like you're over-engineering things. I want to show you how, but you need to use your judgment on to when to scale back based on your own application. Okay. So we've decided to introduce data transfer objects to pass data back from our persistence layer, our contract repository class, to the data contract service, the contract service class. So where are we going to define these data transfer objects? Where are we going to define that class? Well, we have a couple of options here, but for simplicity's sake, we can put them in our domain layer. I'd probably add a folder to keep them, all the DTOs that we create in their own little namespace. So what I'm going to do is go to my domain project, right-click and select Add a new folder, and I'm going to call this just DTOs, something like that, okay? In fact, let me rename that to just DTO. Get rid of the S there. I feel better about that already. Okay, and then what we'll do is right-click this folder and select Add New Class. And I will call this Contract DTO, and I guess I'll just use that camel casing scheme right there. All right, and so here in the new contract.dto, first of all, I'll make this public because we're going to need it, public. And then I'll do a string contract ID, and then prop date time expiration date. Okay. And then the next thing that I want to do, I think I've already done this. Let me just make sure that I have a reference to, yes, I have a reference already to the Acme maintenance domain. Okay, so we're good to go there. And so when I go back to the contract repository, instead of returning back a contract, I'm actually going to return back a contract DTO. And it asks, do you want to use that namespace instead? Yes. In fact, I'm going to get rid of the old one because we don't need that anymore. And this is all we need. Okay, so let's do this now. Here we're going to var contract DTO equals new contract DTO, and I'm going to make a note here that I'm stubbing this out. Ultimately, it will go out to the database and retrieve the given contract record based on the contract ID. But for now, it's just going to be stubbed out. Okay, so contract DTO dot contract ID equals, again, here we're just stubbing it out. We've done this before. Contract DTO dot expiration date equals date time dot now dot add days. Again, stubbing it out. And we're going to return this new instance of contract DTO. Awesome. Okay. Very good. And now that means I need to go back to the contract service, and we're going to need to change a few things around. So I made these notes here on purpose in the previous lesson because this is what I ultimately want to accomplish. So I'm going to create an instance of my persistence layer. So contract repository equals new contract repository. All right. And this is where I don't have the correct reference. We'll get that in just a minute. Okay. And then var contract DTO equals contract repository dot get by ID, passing in the contract ID that we get as an input parameter to our contract services. All right, and then the next thing we'll want to do is pretty much what we've done up to this point, which is create a new instance of contract, but this time instead of setting it equal, we're going to do contract DTO dot contract ID, like so. And then the expiration date, we're not going to hard code it here. We're going to rely on our stub expiration date. Okay. Back in the contract service class, I've updated this code to work with the stub contract repository. As you can see, I haven't created a reference to my domain layer, from my domain layer to my new stub persistence layer. Now, if I were to do this based on what you know from the Application Architecture Fundamental Series, what problem would I be introducing into my application? If I were to go and do this, to the domain layer, right-click, and select Add Reference, and I were to find my persistence layer, and I were to go ahead and check this box, what problem would I be introducing into the application at this point? What will this prevent me from doing in the future? Well, think about that, and we'll talk about it in the next lesson. See you there. Thank you.